A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to True Crime News, the podcast covering high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the country every week. I'm your host, Anna Garcia. Our case this week, a father accused of attempting to poison his 10-year-old daughter while out on bail for allegedly poisoning to death his wife, the girl's mother. The weapon of choice, say authorities, eye drops. Police say the man benefited from a life insurance payout worth $250,000 after his wife's death, but authorities say he will not be able to touch a dime of it to defend himself from these latest charges. Prosecutors say he's also facing charges of setting a medical helicopter on fire while in flight and charges of staging his own kidnapping. We are recording this on Wednesday, August 14th of 2024. Our guest today is Bobby Chacon, a former FBI special agent, a writer, and a new friend to the show. Bobby, welcome to the program. We're so happy to have you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here, Anna. Thank you very much for having me.
It's terrific. You know, people always say, like, where do you find the guests? And I say, on Instagram. We've been communicating for a while on Instagram, and I've been following you, and I find your background so interesting. I know your background, but our listeners don't. Just a little bit about your specialty, because it's not what you would typically expect from the FBI.
Yeah, that's right. So I was an attorney first before I came into the FBI. So I graduated law school and I was an attorney. And then I entered the FBI. And my first assignment was in New York. So I worked the mob, the mafia, and then gangs. And what that did was in those RICO cases we did, it put me in a task force with the NYPD. And we worked so many homicides with the mob and with the gangs that they sent me to NYPD homicide school. Now, my dad and brother were both NYPD homicide detectives and sergeants. And so it was kind of a family affair. And so that's where I learned to work homicides. And I probably worked more homicides than most FBI agents get to work. And so I learned that side of the business through my partners in the NYPD and things like that. And then later in my career, I went into forensics, and I was a forensically trained agent for the last 10 or 15 years of my FBI career through the FBI laboratory. So I ran the FBI's underwater team. So I did underwater forensics mostly in cases like Laci Peterson and Natalie Holloway and things like that, where we deployed my team to try to obtain evidence underwater.
That to me is so fascinating, because that is such a subspecialty, if you will, of forensics and investigation. So that to me is just amazing. Just amazing.
Thank you. Yes.
We're so pleased and honored to have you, Bobby. It's a pleasure, and let's get right to it.
Sure.
All right. So this case is out of Mount Holly, North Carolina. And, you know, we've covered this case previously on the podcast. This would have been when he was first charged with murdering his wife. But now there are new charges. So if a little bit of this sounds familiar, I think it's the helicopter part that really jars everyone's memory here. But he was first charged with killing his wife with eye drops. Now he's facing this new allegation of attempting to poison his 10-year-old daughter, also with eye drops. So the accused here is 39-year-old Joshua Hunsucker. Excuse me, Bobby. I am seeing a trend, at least on the podcast, of these attempted murders or murders using eye drops. What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that, you have to, unfortunately, the internet has opened up everything. And I'm sure if you Google how to kill somebody with eye drops or whatever, there's probably 100 ways that they describe doing it. Unfortunately, that's the downside of the internet, because it used to be like if someone was killed in this way, it's kind of a special way, and you kind of look for somebody who has that kind of knowledge. Of course, in this case, he was, I think, a paramedic. So he knew medications, and he knew, how to give different medications and what their effects might be. At least, in the emergency medical field, they do that in the field sometimes. And so, I think people think that when they poison somebody, it's never going to be discovered, because it's a very non-violent way to do it. It's not blunt trauma. There's no blood spatter. The typical forensic things that we hear about in crime scenes and crime cases is not going to be there. They think they just put this little bit of drops and somebody drinks it and then it's gone forever. It's much like I used to find in the forensic diving where they throw a piece of evidence in the water and they think once it disappears in the water, it's gone forever. And I think that's the kind of thing that the mindset that happens with poisoning. Unfortunately for them, the advances in toxicology and in labs and things like that we can really go in there into tissues and human tissue and find these substances if you can get them to the body in time.
Yeah, and because the poisoning presents itself as so many different things, like you're not feeling well, it could be fatigue, your heart is racing, you have diarrhea. It's a multitude of symptoms that present, and so you're constantly going to the emergency room or the doctor, and you're not feeling well, and you're declining. But most people, and I would think most doctors or trauma centers, don't think the first thing to look for is, eye drop poisoning, right? Most people come in, did they eat something? Are they having an allergic reaction? Is there something else going on? So what we're seeing in some of these cases is by the time they figure out what it is, it's too late. The person has died because they've been sick for such a long time. And in this case, his wife, Stacy, ended up getting so ill for so long, she ended up needing a pacemaker. So when she did pass at the age of 32, the assumption was her troubled heart had given out, which kind of made sense until he started giving authorities, according to authorities, various descriptions and stories about how he discovered her. And Bobby, I would think if you find your wife dead, there really should be only one version of that, right? The one version that happened.
You would think. I mean, it's such a traumatic event in anybody's life that you would remember it detail by detail, very detailed, and that wouldn't change. Why would it ever change? I mean, sometimes if you're part of the trauma, if you're in a car accident with somebody and they die, you might remember things differently because of your own trauma that impacted you. But here, there's no trauma to him in this situation. And not only did he tell authorities different stories, he told a neighbor a different story, then he told a friend a different story, then he told a coworker a different story. So these are all like people that don't have a vested interest in prosecuting him. These are independent sources that he's telling these different stories to. And in this case, yeah, I mean, the story, normally with a homicide, you try to look at the story beforehand, and in this case also, but a lot of this story happens after he allegedly committed this murder.
Yep. And of course, he says that he is innocent, that he did not try to kill his wife. He says on everything that he's been charged with, he says he has entered a plea in that which he has of not guilty. So everything from the accusations of killing his wife, poisoning his daughter, and accusations of setting the helicopter on fire, all of this, he says, that he did not do. So for me, the helicopter thing was very intriguing because it literally happened the month before he was charged with his wife's murder. And the reason I found it so interesting is because the pressure was on, because the investigation was getting really intense. And here he is, a paramedic, working on this helicopter. The authorities say, and the other people on the helicopter say, he started a fire, which caused the helicopter to land in a car dealership. So those facts are not disputed. The fact that it was an emergency landing, whether he caused the fire that caused the emergency landing, those facts are obviously disputed by him. But I do find that fascinating that if these allegations are true, his reaction to pressure, if we are to believe the laundry list of allegations against him, he seems to have a pattern here of constantly reacting in like a crazy way.
Yes. I mean, when I first read this, I was like, he knew something was coming down because, like you said, a month later, he was charged with his wife's murder, and it was a long investigation. So he probably knew those charges were coming down. Now, they've charged him with that fire on the helicopter. So they feel confident that they have enough evidence to prove him guilty of that. So it's not just a kind of a rumor. I mean, they've charged him with it. So, they must have pretty strong evidence to go forward with that. Now, again, it's just an allegation. But, I started thinking to myself, is this, because if you've been, I've been around helicopters. Spent a lot of time in helicopters. Even on like a plane, they're very delicate in the air, and most people don't survive a helicopter crash. I mean, when they crash, they crash. And I wondered whether or not this was a suicide attempt. I mean, because you don't cause a fire. I mean, he was a paramedic in a helicopter. He knew how helicopters operate. And he must have known that helicopters, when they crash, there are very, very rarely survivors. So to cause something like that would cause an emergency, I thought either two things. He was trying to be a hero, setting a way he would look like a hero in putting the fire out and saving the crew, or suicide by setting that chopper on fire to where it would crash. Either of those two kind of crossed my mind.
And both would be crazy, right? I mean,
absolutely
not the best way to deal with a situation, because you are endangering everyone else on that helicopter, and then anyone below it should it be a crash landing. So
absolutely. I mean, but look, in the overall allegations in this case, I mean, this is a guy who allegedly murdered his wife and then allegedly poisoned his own daughter. So, I mean, I don't think he has a lot of thought process about other people's safety or care.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Okay, so as you're probably noticing here, the case against Joshua Lee Hunsucker is complicated, but all the pieces, authorities say, are connected. So his wife Stacy died in September of 2018, and again, it was first believed that her heart gave out. Now, Joshua, as we said, was working as a paramedic at Atrium Health and always part of that air unit. Stacy had worked as a paralegal. The two of them had met in high school. Very romantic story. You meet in high school, you marry your high school sweetheart, and both active members of their church, and then, they have their family together. Now, after her first child is when Stacy starts becoming very ill. So the first daughter, is born in February of 2013, and that's when she starts to suffer medical problems. I just have a question for you, Bobby. It's not charged here, so this would be pure speculation and observation on your part. If indeed the poisoning started then, and we have no idea, if it started way back then, after the arrival of the baby, do you believe that there was something deeper, weird, or more weird psychologically going on here, potentially, with this guy?
There could be. I mean, I have talked to friends of mine who are in that field, the forensic psychology and things like that, and after the birth of a child, you often, well, first of all, the mother having medical issues, not necessarily uncommon after a birth, but the father, or of the child, often goes through a change. Even in like I said, in Lacey Peterson, Scott killed her. She was not 8.5 months pregnant. He had a pending child coming. So I think some men have a hard time adjusting to that new role, and feel if they felt a little bit trapped or suffocated in the marriage, then with the child coming, that might exacerbate that feeling. That's just from friends of mine in that field when I've talked to them about these type of situations, because oftentimes it is either right after the birth or shortly when the child's very young that the father realizes his life has changed dramatically and permanently, and that causes them, if they have these issues, it causes them to kind of exacerbate those issues.
Yeah, I just find the timing interesting. Again, I don't know whether she was just ill at that time or whether this is when the poisoning began. So now here's another thing. I mean, it's either this is the most unlucky, unfortunate family, calamity family, right? Or something is afoul here. 5 months after the baby's born, their house burns down. Coincidence? Given everything else?
He's already been charged with setting a fire. Okay, he's charged with that, setting a fire on a helicopter. And now you look back in the history, and his house suddenly catches on fire and burns down. So, like you said, these are coincidences, perhaps, and perhaps not.
Yeah. So then November of 2014, the couple welcomes their second child into the world, and Stacy's health problems continue. She is admitted to the hospital with various symptoms, low blood pressure, low heart rate. She even has to be admitted into the ICU after a while. More hospitalizations. The following year, 2015, she's finally given a pacemaker because her heart is giving out. So it is now presumed she has very serious heart disease to have a pacemaker at such a young age. It would be 3 years later, when Stacey is 32, that she would be dead. And again, the initial reaction was, oh my God, this woman has suffered for years with one health crisis after another, and her body gave out. But police say that is not the case at all. They say that she was actually poisoned, and that is what killed her. But it's how police say they found the poison because she was cremated, to me is like there was a little bit of grace of God working in here, a little bit of grace of God. So I want to get to Joshua's story just very briefly, because again, he gives so many stories that I don't want to give credence to the fact that there are 4 versions of this, because I don't know which one is true. So what isn't disputed is that he found her, right? That in all of his versions, he says he found her. So he found Stacey in September of 2018. Remember, he's a paramedic, right? He's a paramedic. And he said she wasn't breathing and that her skin was blue. So there wasn't anything that he could do. And he told people all these different stories. He went to burn off energy, that he was working on the computer and then turned around and found her. I mean, again, all these different versions. So police were always a little bit suspicious. But the most suspicious of all would have been Stacey's parents, his in-laws. They just absolutely didn't buy it, because here's what happens after Stacey dies, right? So he has her cremated immediately, doesn't want an autopsy, says, what's the point? I don't want her cut up. This is the part I don't get. She's an organ donor.
Yeah, so am I, and my wife knows that, and so like if I died, my wife knows automatically that all my organs that are salvageable should be donated, and she knows that, and that's something we've talked about, and it's on my driver's license, and it's something that's just known, and him as a paramedic being in the medical field, and her being in the legal field. I mean, I would imagine there was a discussion about this at some point in their marriage, even a casual conversation about it, and so in my mind, he cremated her against her wishes.
It was just so quick, right? It just seemed like it seemed to go against everything that she seemed to stand for and his understanding of medicine, right? As a paramedic, yeah, if you're an organ donor, they will have to, cut your body. So he was very quick to do that. And then, like within 2 days of her death, he filed for the life insurance policy or policies, which were worth $250,000. But that wasn't all. That was suspicious enough, say, the in-laws. And everyone reacts to grief differently. And there are 2 children, small children. It's the fact that a new girlfriend moves in ASAP. And the in-laws are like, well, where did she come from?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, and you just hit on the 3 things in homicides that we used to focus on: means, motive, and opportunity, right? The means, that he have the means to do it. He's in the medical field. He knows how to poison somebody. The motive you hit on was the insurance policy 2 days after her death. I mean, some people are still grieving and not even able to find papers in the house that, because there's a process you have to go through. And then the opportunity. And he was in that house at the time of her death. Now he gives at least 4 different versions of how he found her, like you said. So one, he's just looking the other way and he turns around and she's slumped over the couch. Another one where he's out of the house going for a walk and comes back and she's dead. There's multiple stories that he himself gives that differ vastly in how it happened. So yeah, he had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to do it. And like you said, he's a paramedic. Even if he turned around and she was dead, even if she was blue. I was an EMT. I was a SWAT medic in the FBI, so EMTA, an advanced EMT. But I rode with paramedics all the time in helicopters and in ambulances. And Those guys don't give up. If you just died, they always have the belief they can try to bring you back, and that's their job. They don't really treat you. They just have to keep you alive to get you to the hospital. That's what they want to do. That's their whole focus. And so for him not to have done, and those guys always have kits at home. They have medic bags everywhere. And for him not to have started an IV on her or give her some kind of life-saving attempts just to like say, oh, she was dead, she was blue, I knew she was dead. Like, that's not what a paramedic would normally do. Those guys go to great lengths, usually superhuman lengths, to either bring somebody back or keep them alive long enough to get them to the hospital. And so for him to just now a lay person who doesn't have that medical background, I understand. But him, for not to have broken out his kit and tried everything he could to revive her and to get her, transported, is a little bit disingenuous to me.
I think so too, especially when it's your wife. Like, you would do everything within your power, So the new girlfriend moves in, and the former in-laws are very suspicious here because now they think he was probably having an affair before Stacy passed, making them think, maybe she didn't die of natural causes. So Stacy's parents then take their suspicions to the police, the authorities, and they also take it to state insurance investigators because it's what he did with the money that was bothering them. He paid off the house, he bought a $100,000 boat, and then he took a bunch of exotic vacations with the new girlfriend. So the North Carolina Department of Insurance began investigating the case, which I always find interesting. From your perspective, Bobby, it's state insurance investigators investigating as opposed to a homicide or police investigating. Is that, that's where the investigation went. Is that where it should have gone?
Well, they're parallel investigating. They do parallel investigations. And oftentimes, like a lot of friends of mine that retired from the FBI are insurance investigators now in their retired life. They have a second career because it's basically fraud, right? And a lot of the FBI agents I knew worked fraud cases. So that's a great background for them when they retire to get a second job, a second career as insurance investigators. So a lot of them are former law enforcement, former detectives, and they know these kinds of cases. So their client is the insurance company, right? We don't want to pay this out if he did this murder, but oftentimes it's a parallel investigation with the homicide, and they keep in touch with law enforcement on what they're finding. Law enforcement sometimes doesn't give the information back to them. If it's a criminal case, you got to be careful with that kind of stuff for grand jury material and stuff. But oftentimes they're working kind of parallel, and they're talking to each other about the cases, about what they're finding.
Mm-hmm. So we mentioned that if Stacy hadn't been an organ donor, probably we would have never discovered, at least this is what investigators say, they would have never discovered that there was tetrahydrozoline in her system. Because she was an organ donor, someone somewhere in the hospital realized that a tissue sample had been already taken and left and was in the lab somewhere in the hospital. Ding, 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 ding. She's been cremated, but there's still a little bit of Stacy left. Let's test it. And when they tested, they found tetrahydrozoline in Stacy's tissues and 30 to 40 times higher than the therapeutic dose, meaning there was no reason for it to be in her system.
That's right. 30 to 40 times if you use eye drops, if you put it in your eye and your body absorbed that, it was 30 to 40 times that amount that you'd normally use. That's unheard of. Like, how it would be hard to even get that into your system using it the proper way and dropping it into your eyes. And people, and boy, they got this by a slither of hope because, he did, if you're going to kill somebody and want toxicology not to happen, you cremate that body. And luckily, in this case, somebody did take a sample because you have to have a blood sample to know where those organs are going to go because the blood types, have to match in certain ways to go to the organ recipient. And so, yes, it was a stroke of luck that they got that. And people don't realize, like, you can't just run a blood test and say, okay, tell me everything that's in this blood. They do what's called a panel, and they have to test for certain things. And so you don't get a list of every single thing. They have to know what they're looking for. So they have to test for tetrahydrozoline. tetradrozoline. They have to test for certain poisons in there. So they have to kind of have an idea of what they're looking for in the lab before they actually do those tests, because there's not like a one size fits all, tell me everything that's in this blood sample. The lab has to kind of be looking for something, and then they find it.
Mm-hmm. And this was a sample that Stacy gave them before she died. It wasn't, remember, she died, then she's cremated. So this was a sample that was held in the hospital for other purposes that they were able to retrieve. So why would you test it for something like that, right? It
Right.
was for a different use and purpose. I just think it's like a little piece of miracle in here, a little miracle working. So,
I oftentimes in some of these cases, and we saw it in the Delphi murders, I often say sometimes like it's a, if you're a spiritual person, it's the victim reaching out and catching their own killer. Whether it's that little girl on the bridge that takes the photograph, or, it's kind of that, like, the victim somehow reaches back and helps solve the case. And I think that's what happened in this case.
Oh, I agree with you, Bobby. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, so all that's going on, the investigation's happening. And then just to give you the perspective, to get back on our timeline, so they've now identified the tetrahydrozoline in Stacy's blood. And now the investigation, right? Because now we're looking at the insurance, all these other things. And his behavior is becoming erratic. So in November of 2019, that's when the whole helicopter thing happens, where there's a fire and they make the emergency landing. And then the very next month, December 19th, 2019, Joshua was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in Stacy's death. However, he would not be held for very long because he got out on Christmas Eve. He bonded out. Bond was high, $1.5 million. So he had to put a lot of money down, but he got out. So he's now out. He has entered his plea of not guilty on the accusations of murdering his wife, and his children apparently are with his sister, and a lot of moving parts here. But this next phase of Joshua's life, this is really important because this is what leads to the next set of charges and a lot more erratic behavior, according to prosecutors. Stacy's parents are still furious, right? They're like, okay, we are not satisfied, especially since he's out. So they continue to seek justice, and they file a wrongful death lawsuit against him. This is in addition to what is happening criminally. Does that seem like kind of early to file that kind of a case while the criminal case is still going on? Or does it, does that not matter?
Well, it doesn't matter because it's two different parties, right? It's sometimes the investigators on the criminal side, it's a headache for them because, it's the same witnesses are being deposed as they have witnesses in the grand jury and things like that. But, her parents were really a moving force in this thing, and they were keeping the heat on him. And, they were being denied access to their two granddaughters. And that just pained them gratefully. And so I think that they were the ones, trying to push him, and they were mad that he got bonded out. And then they were mad they were being denied access to their grandchildren. And so they were trying every way they could. And the frustration is building because now it's been years since Stacy's death. And he, and then of course he started going back after them in kind. And so it really became, a battle between him and them. And so they thought, let's file this lawsuit. Let's put even more heat on him.
And there was a lot of pressure. They claim that Joshua was intimidating them, that both he would harass them if they were all, let's say, at a kid's game or any events. He would either make, verbal threats, intimidating gestures, and they felt that he was threatening them. Mind you, he then makes a claim, and this one was extraordinary. He makes a claim that while he's on the side of the road fixing a tire, Doesn't this sound like another
Yeah,
crazy case?
Alex Murdaugh.
What is it with changing a tire on the side of the road down in the Carolinas?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought of.
Like and then he says his elderly father-in-law tried to kidnap him, abduct him, and zip tied him. And he calls the police, and then the police investigate, and they say, we don't find any evidence of you having been either abducted or held or tied up.
Yeah, and he's a big dude. He's like 6'1" or 6'2", 220. You know, he's a bigger dude. So for him to turn around and say, oh, this guy got me into zip ties, you know, this elderly man got me, a 6'2", 200-pound, 220-pound guy, he got me into zip ties and he was kidnapping me. I mean, it strains credibility, and the cops just said there's absolutely zero chance that this actually happened.
So while this is still going on, then Stacy's parents file a motion to try and get custody of their grandchildren. Apparently, the girls are with Josh's sister, and Stacy's parents want the kids with them. So this, of course, is increasing the pressure. And so while this is going on, the 10-year-old girl is starting to get sick. This is according to both court records and records filed by the grandparents. So this would be nearly 5 years after Stacy's death. The 10-year-old starts to get very sick, requiring hospitalization. Her symptoms are very similar, according to court records. Low blood pressure for a 10-year-old, heart rate, extreme exhaustion, constricted blood vessels. She's treated multiple times, multiple facilities. And so court records allege that after she got sick on February 24th of 2023 last year, I don't know how or who, we don't know those details in the investigation, she tested positive, allegedly, for tetrahydrozoline after submitting a urine sample.
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, the symptoms were very similar to her mother, right? So they have already known the mother had tetrahydrozoline in her system. So when they start now, they've got something to go on. Now they have a starting point. With Stacy, they didn't have that starting point. They didn't know. Why would you look for tetrahydrozoline in someone's blood? I mean, that's not something you'd normally look for. But now that they have, the mother apparently died of this poisoning of this, let's look if she has it in her system. And sure enough, they hit it, and it's the same thing. Now, why he would use the same method, I think, I've got a lot of friends who are defense attorneys. I can see them saying, well, it really wasn't the tetrahydrozoline that killed her. It was some kind of genetic abnormality that hit the mother, and she hereditarily passed it on to her daughter, because it's the same symptoms and the same kind of physical manifestations of the symptoms. And so I can see a creative defense attorney saying, oh, this wasn't poisoning. This was just some genetic something that mother had and she died of, and now the daughter has it.
Except then what? Their bodies just manifest tetrahydrozoline? It's part of their genetic disorder that they create a lot of eye drops in their system?
I'm not saying it's believable. I'm saying I know a lot of defense attorneys who have to get up in court and say something about their client.
Wow. So, this is very serious. You have a little girl here, a minor, who apparently was very ill, so ill that she needed multiple trips to a hospital, and the allegations are very serious that she had tetrahydrozoline allegedly in her system. So earlier this month, on August 6th, Joshua was arrested yet again, and this time he was charged with 4 counts of witness intimidation, 4 counts of obstruction of justice, and prosecutors say that Stacy's parents are seeking a bond revocation for Joshua, claiming that they fear further retaliatory acts against them, worried about the children, obviously. And in the arrest documents, the prosecutors also had a section in there about the 10-year-old being allegedly poisoned. What I don't understand is I don't see that as a charge specific.
Yeah, not yet. He has not been charged with that. He's been charged with things around it, like tampering with a witness. I mean, how can you say he tampered with his daughter if you're not alleging the poisoning yet? And that may be simply that they're trying to line up their ducks. They're trying to get everything they can. Maybe they want more toxicology. Maybe they want more something. They probably have it on their board, one of the charges, because they are not afraid to keep adding charges to this guy. That's what they've been doing for years. I mean, he's gotten more charges since the death of Stacy than he had before. So, I mean, it's like, everything he does, they're on him and they charge him with intimidation, obstruction, all this other stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if they ultimately charge him with the poisoning of the daughter. I think they probably have to interview the daughter and to see. And then the question becomes, I hate to say it, but did his sister play a role? Because the sister basically has custody of the kids now, because he signed custody over, I think the day after he was arrested for Stacy's murder, he signed custody over he had a custody agreement drawn up with the sister. That was probably to protect them from the grandparents getting custody. And so the grandparents have actually filed for custody, like you said. But so, I think eventually he could be charged with that as well.
Is it possible, and I have no idea, but is it possible that they moved on the charges, which they could move on as quickly as possible because they may have feared the children could have been in danger, and these were charges that they could file immediately, which would, of course, revoke bond because he's out on another case, and then just, I guess, to insulate and protect the children as quickly as possible?
I think that's exactly right. And not only the children, the grandparents too. I mean, they're under threat too. I mean, the longer this guy's out, the more pressure, and they keep adding charges, the more pressure he's under. And we've already seen what he's capable of when he's under pressure. So I think you're right. I think that for them to charge the daughter's poisoning, they've got a little more work to do. When you interview a child, for example, one of these cases, you have to do it in the right way. There are laws protecting children in these situations. You have to have a psychologist in there, or at least observing, or actually doing the interview and stuff. So that it's a little more than just knocking on somebody's door and taking notes. When you're interviewing a child, you have to have there's a certain structure to it. And so that takes time. And so maybe, I think you're right. That's exactly what I was thinking too. Get him off the street, revoke his bond, and keep the children safe and keep the grandparents safe, keep all your witnesses safe. Because the thing is, going forward, all you have is your witnesses. I mean, in this case, you do have a lot of physical evidence, but you have to have those witnesses at trial, and they have to not be scared and intimidated to testify, and they have to be around to do it. And if they're under threat of their own safety, which in this case they were, I think you have to revoke his bail. And I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's a hearing on whether or not his bail will stay revoked.
Yeah, and that's not for a while. It's scheduled for
October. Yeah.
Right, yeah. October 7th, which means he's going to sit and he's going to stew for a while, which also makes me wonder if that's all the time that they need to get all these toxicology reports in, and those allegations or extra charges will go towards determining whether a new bond will be set at all.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And then going forward after that, probably next year, we'll be talking about whether or not, they're going to bring in those charges together. In other words, if he goes to trial on Stacy's murder, do you also charge him with the poisoning of the child? Because those two things, obviously, the same method was used, and the jury wants to hear, like, we did it once that way, did another, and I believe I think he might have even told friends that if he ever killed somebody, that's how he'd do it.
Very scary. And at the end of the day, the littlest victims here are the two daughters whose mother has passed. They are without a mother, and currently their father is sitting in jail, accused of taking their mother from them, and potentially accused of trying to take one of the little girls. So, and then all of the extended family and the trauma that this has created. But what a wrecking ball this man has taken to this family and to these little girls' lives.
Absolutely. And if you don't think these little girls are in danger, all you have to do is look at past history. I mean, like we said, like we referenced before, I mean, Scott Peterson killed his 8.5-month pregnant wife, Connor. They had already named the baby Connor. He killed his son. Chris Watts goes out and kills his wife and his two daughters, I think a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, because he had a girlfriend. Scott Peterson had a girlfriend. Now, Joshua, in this case, had a girlfriend, and so it's not beyond reason or beyond experience that, they kill the wife and then they harm the children.
But before we move on, I've got I have to ask you about Scott Peterson. I mean, I wasn't really thinking about it, but since you brought it up, because he's now got the Innocence Project working on his case, and they're making allegations that the investigation didn't look at everything that they could have. And is it really possible that maybe he didn't kill her? What do you think?
Well, look, if you, short of having a confession or short of having a video of the person doing it, there's always a possibility, but is it a reasonable possibility? That's the standard in law, as we all know, is beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's always unreasonable doubts. I mean, and so I was a juror on a murder trial last year in California for 5.5 months. I was actually the jury foreman. And you talk about reasonable doubt. Yes, it was. Yeah, I know it's very, very, very unlikely that I would be a juror. And I was a juror on a murder with special circumstances case. It was the highest charge in California.
I mean, I'm glad that you were picked in the sense that you truly get the law, and it makes sense that you would be the jury foreman. But I've never been picked. Nobody ever wants me on a jury.
Nobody ever wanted me either. And I went through extensive voir dire by the defense counsel, and I was selected for the jury. And it was a 5.5 month trial. So we heard a lot of evidence, a lot of testimony. But yeah, I mean, there's always a doubt when you're sitting there as a jury. And I got to tell you, when I was a jury on day one and opening statements, I had a lot of doubt whether or not the defendant was, and it was a retrial, and he was convicted on the first trial. I had a lot of doubt whether he was innocent or guilty. But over the course of the trial, you kind of look, and the police explained these other theories that the defense had and why they weren't reasonable to look at. So yes, are there other possibilities in the Scott Peterson case? Yes. Are they reasonable? In my mind, no. And so a defense attorney is always going to, short of a confession or short of it happening on videotape, a defense attorney is always going to be able to suggest some other type of possibility of what happened. And that's what's happening in Scott Peterson case. But our system is set up so that you can introduce those things in your defense, and you can try to convince one juror out of 12 that that's a reasonable doubt. And if you can't do that, then you're convicted, and that's it. Game is over. Now they're trying to change the rules after the game is over, but I have a lot of doubt on the motivations of, and the Innocence Project here in California does some great work.
Yeah.
I was a little disappointed they took this case up, but sometimes people that work, on cases that are dependent on charitable contributions need media attention, and this is certainly something that's gotten them a lot of media attention. Unfortunately, not all of it's good, but it's certainly put them in the spotlight.
I have to admit, when I heard that the Innocence Project had taken this on, it gave me pause and made me look deeper. And again, because, okay, everyone, as you know, who's been convicted of a crime and sits behind bars says they're innocent, right? 99% of them say that they're innocent. 1% says, yeah, I did it. 99% say that they're innocent. 99% are constantly trying to get out and trying to get someone to take their case. And groups like the Innocence Project don't have the resources and the people and the bandwidth to take these cases. They go through such arduous process themselves to choose a case. So when they do, my feeling, just as a journalist, is like, okay, it's gone through their vetting process, and they see something there, because this is such a controversial case, and so not a sympathetic case. I don't know how else to put it. Sometimes there are people behind bars who you have some compassion for, but I think that the country does not have much compassion for Scott Peterson. So that's why, and if you work that case, that's why I'm just like, wow, this could be a very interesting turn of events.
Yeah, I was asked to bring my dive team up to Richmond Bay in San Francisco and search for Laci, parts of Laci. When she washed ashore, her head, hands, and feet were missing. So we were looking for her head, hands, and feet. Her torso was in the medical examiner's office already. So we searched Richmond Bay for those pieces, because the allegation was that Scott had tied weights to her ankles, her wrists, and her neck. And then over the course of those 4 months she was in the water, the salt water works as an astringent, almost like sandpaper. And it kind of wore her joints down wherever she was, the pressure from the weights, and her body was moving up and down with the tide. It was a very tidal area. And so the tide would push her up and down. And then a storm came through and broke her free. And where her joints had loosened and weakened through the work of the salt water, her hands, head, and feet stayed on the bottom attached to those weights. That's the theory. And so when she washed up and I saw her remains, those things were missing. And so, and Connor washed up about a mile down the beach because he was ejected from her womb, and he was very pristine. So he must have been inside of her for those 4 months. And when the storm pushed her loose, she tumbled across the bottom, lacerating her womb and ejecting Connor, and he washed up a distance away from her. But yeah, Scott had money. He had a good defense. There's nothing new emerged since then. These theories that they're alleging were alleged back then. Now the police look into these things, and how far down all these different avenues go, that's a point of contention. So when they say, oh, the police never looked at it, that's not necessarily true. The police may have looked at it. They just didn't go down that road as far as the defense wanted them to go. They looked at this other possibility and said, it didn't happen that way. There's some little things that point that way, but there are other things that kind of point us back here. And so they've taken stuff that was available back then, the break-ins in the neighborhood and the burglaries and things like that were known to his defense then. They could have raised it at trial then. If whether they did or didn't, that was the defense's theory, and that was the defense's option to do then. When you start now going back and finding new witnesses that say different things than they said back then, that's to me, a little suspect, because all people, a lot of people want publicity. They want to get their names out. And so now you find these new witnesses that say different things. And, I don't know. I'm very suspect of that case.
Yeah, no, I can understand. You've got skin in the game here. I get that. I really do. You investigated it, and that is a horrific thing to see. And you know things that the rest of us do not know. But it is a case that has given me pause, and I suspect a lot of people. And time does change sometimes perspective. So we'll see what happens. It's going to, ultimately it will be for a court to decide if anything changes in any way on this case.
Right. I mean, that's good. I mean, in a way, it's good to have reviews, right? I mean, we oftentimes now, a lot of district attorney offices have conviction review units who are going back and looking at questionable, I wouldn't say questionable, but close calls and things like that. And they're going and looking back at those convictions. And I think that's a good part of the process. I'm not against that. I'm not against, a district attorney spending time looking at prior convictions and whether or not they were legitimate. I mean, I do have a lot of respect for our system, and I think you have to respect the system, or else when people lose confidence in the system, all hope is lost. And I think that you have to have a certain respect for the system, but that's not to say that the system isn't infallible and that a conviction review unit can do some good work.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. What a bonus. Thank you, Bobby.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It is time for our comment section. These are the crime cases you all are talking about on social media. And here's our producer, Will Updike. Hey, Will.
Hey, how's it going, Anna?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Bobby, how are you? Great to meet you.
Good. Thanks for having me. Good to meet you.
Absolutely. So this week we have a case of an interesting way to try to get a break. This case comes out of Savannah, Georgia, where a McDonald's employee has been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison after lighting a dumpster on fire to clear out the restaurant because he thought the location was too busy. So this incident dates back to April of 2023 when Joshua Darrell McGregor was working at a Montgomery Avenue location there in Savannah, Georgia, and he just started to become irritated with how busy the store was. Interesting little side note. He was also training to become a manager at the restaurant at the time. So, you would think he'd be accustomed to, maybe a customer rush, have some good problem solving skills. You never know. But he gets the great idea that he's going to try to clear this restaurant out by starting a fire. So he lights a piece of cardboard on fire. He throws it into this dumpster that's allegedly filled with a bunch of other cardboard, as you can imagine, and apparently some other flammable contents. And prosecutors say, this was pretty contemplated. He went outside, like he made sure that the fire was going before, kind of like stoking before he returned to the restaurant. And then just complicating any sort of defense on this furthermore, he filmed himself setting this dumpster fire, posted it on social media. And he was also, of course, it's a McDonald's. They got cameras everywhere. He's also, of course, caught on surveillance camera setting this fire. Not a lot you can really work with there. So 1 month later after the incident, he ended up pleading guilty. So that was in May of last year. like I said, not really a lot of other options for our friend Daryl here. So why this is back in the news is sort of both sides have been going back and forth about the actual sentence. Apparently, prosecutors initially recommended 15 years, which seems pretty steep for a dumpster fire. Yeah, seems really
People
pretty
commit
steep.
murder and don't get 15 years. Let's be reasonable here.
Yeah. And then Daryl's defense, that they didn't think, he was going to end up ultimately spend any time behind bars. They thought, maybe some restitution, some sort of supervised probation, something like that. They said Josh is a good man that made a mistake and he will move past this. Judge didn't exactly see it the same way. Sentenced Daryl to 5 years in prison. He'll also be required to pay restitution for any property damage. And once he is released, he'll still be subject to 3 additional years of supervised release.
And no one was injured, right?
No one was injured. Yeah. It's just the
it doesn't even
property
sound like
damage.
there was a lot of, and it doesn't even sound like there was a lot of property damage. I mean, the whole restaurant didn't burn down, right? I mean, it was just it's a very unusual case in that, first of all, federal prosecutors don't usually take cases like that. That usually they leave it to the state. Arson is on all the state books. Sometimes when there's a federal and a state crime that overlap, they just let the state handle it if it's like this. I mean, it's very surprising to me, number one, that the federal authorities took it, that some federal agency did the investigation, and then the federal prosecutor's office actually took it. The second thing that surprised me is you said he pled guilty. Normally, when you plead guilty, there's a deal on the table. And the federal prosecutors say, we're going to recommend this sentence. And the defense says, okay, we're agreeing that. And the judge almost always adopts whatever the federal prosecutor's office says is part of the deal. Now, in this case, the judge doesn't have to. He might, what they call, depart up from the deal. But it's hard for me to believe that the defense agreed to a 5-year sentence in prison. Because remember, I know a lot of people think that, well, he's going to be eligible for parole. Normally in state systems, most state systems, you're eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of the minimum. So if it's like 10 to life, you're eligible for parole after 3 1/3 years. In the federal system, there is no parole anymore. So you have to serve every day that you're sentenced to. You get, I think, 1 day off of every 54. So it's really like between 85 and 90% of your sentence you are going to spend in federal custody, regardless of good behavior or anything else. So they did away with federal parole many years ago. And so those 5 years, he's going to spend 85 to 90% of that time in jail. And so it's hard for me to think that his defense would sign an agreement to that for this kind of case, because he would have never been sentenced to that, say, if we went to a state court. No injuries, not a whole lot of property damage. If it was his first offense, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me like something, like you said, Anna, we've seen a lot more people get a lot more dangerous people get a lot less time in jail.
That's not fair. It really isn't. And that to me is where the system does not work. We always talk about what would justice look like in a particular case. And I know that justice is, I always say, community-based, regionally based. States are different. And we always struggle when there isn't enough of a penalty. But then equally wrong is when you have too much of a penalty for a crime like this.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, in the federal system in the 80s, when I started working in the 80s and 90s, we had something called the federal sentencing guidelines. And basically, it took away a lot of the discretion judges had, where they could say, you're going to go here or you're going to go there. And like you said, a guy for the same crime in New York gets sentenced to this, and a guy in Arizona for the same crime gets sentenced to a completely different sentence. And what the federal guidelines did was it took almost all the discretion away from the judges. It had columns and rows. And if you were a criminal history of 1, 2, or 3, or 4, and your crime was a category 1, 2, 3, or 4, you go across the row, and then you go down the column, and then boom, that's your range. And the judge had to sentence you to, it was a range, say 120 months to 135 months. So it wasn't a big range. So you knew kind of what you were going to get. And I always, now the judges didn't like it, because the judges like all that discretion in sentencing. They like to do whatever they want. Now, it took a lot of the discretion away. So a few years later, all the federal judges got together, they formed a sentencing commission, and they kind of knocked the guidelines out. But to me, when I was working, it was always better for me to go in with a defendant in a drug case or gang case and say, if we convict you, here's what you're going to get. It's almost like informed consent. If you want to sign the deal, here's what you're going to get. So the defendant kind of knew. He kind of knew what they were going to get. So he could make the deal or not make the deal. I would say this is all business. It's not personal. If you don't want to go to trial with us, that's fine. We're going to convict you. But that's fine. That's you're right. It's nothing personal. I won't hold it. I'm not going to be mad at you. But this is the deal I can make for you. And here's what you're going to get. This is what the judge is going to get. Now, it's hard to make those deals if you say, we're going to tell the judge you cooperated. We're going to say you were a good guy, but the judge is going to be able to do whatever he wants. And if the judge doesn't like you, you might get all the way this time. And if he likes you, you're going to get a lot less time. So the defendants have less of a certainty now when you're making those deals into what they're going to get sentenced to. And I was always a big fan of the guidelines because they were very strict. But to me, they let the defendant know he could make a much more informed decision. And like I said, he could do it or not do it. But then the federal judges didn't like it very much, and they fought it. And a couple of years later, and they're still there. The guidelines are still there, but the judges can kind of do whatever they want.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it does seem like an odd position to agree to as the defense if you were thinking like 0 time behind bars. I just wanted to share this quote because I think we're all in agreement. Like, this does seem fairly extreme for this. But this was like a joint investigation between Savannah's fire arson unit and obviously the federal authorities, including the ATF. And the special agent in charge for the ATF Atlanta Field Division said this about it. They said, arson is an extremely violent crime that not only destroys property, but also places firefighters, first responders, and the general public at great risk. The ATF, along with Savannah's Fires Arson Unit and our other law enforcement partners, are committed to ensuring that our communities are safe and that those who commit these dangerous acts are held accountable. So I don't know if maybe part of their reasoning for that sentence was, the possibility of danger to firefighters or, any sort of first responders.
Well, yeah. I mean, generally, I think I agree with his statement generally, right? I mean, and there have been people that have started innocent fires and then they got out of control and firemen died or civilians died or whatever. But in this case, I think, I don't know, and I don't know anything about his background, his personal history, but it seemed like he may have been having a little bit of a mental break. This is an act. If it's, you'd have to look into his background. They do a sentencing report on people like this in the federal system where they go out and they interview family and friends and coworkers. What was he like and stuff. And so the judge gets this report, this pre-sentence report on what kind of person this was. And if it's just the fact that he wasn't dealing with the pressure of his job very well and he really made this horrendous mistake, then I still think it's probably a very harsh sentence. If he's going around setting a bunch of other fires and he's just, a guy that's out of control, that's another question. And the ATF SAC's statement would be more apropos to somebody like that. But if this was somebody who, he had a career, he had a job, he was kind of escalating his career, he was getting promoted, and he just couldn't handle the pressure somehow for some reason, I just think that 5 years in federal prison is a little tough.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people kind of agreed in the comments. Nuke X said 5 years for lighting a dumpster on fire, plus a fine for the amount of damage done to said dumpster. There are people with more serious crimes that were punished much less than that. So, yeah, especially, I didn't realize that thing that you brought up about like the federal sentencing, like he's going to serve 90% of this, basically.
Yeah.
There's
at least 85%.
Less. Yeah. 85. Right. Okay.
Yeah, at least 85.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a long time. Dragon B empathized with this. They said, honestly, yeah, it'd be like that. I did work a lot of service industry jobs. I do remember the rush. There is a lot of times where you think about maybe clearing customers out. Never really got that far for me, not to lighting a fire. Maybe saying that we were out of something on the menu that we weren't out of. Another commenter had some comments on how to do this maybe next time. They said, Felicia C said, would have been easier to just pull the fire alarm, which
yes.
I feel like that makes more sense even, right? It's like more direct because I don't know how you're expecting to clear people out with like a fire in the back of the restaurant, like in a dumpster. Right. Like who's even going to see that really? Yeah. I don't know. There was some bad logic going on here. I'm going to close it out with a comment from Alvaros who said, but was that in the employee's manual that he can't do that? Maybe he didn't know. And, I don't know if that's a part of manager training over there at McDonald's, but, maybe it needs to be a part of the employee. What am I trying to say here? The employee, when they start you out as an employee, the employee introduction,
your onboarding.
Orientation. Thank you. They need to make that a part of employee orientation. Hey, maybe don't start a fire if things get
That's part of, those are our rules. Yeah. For the podcast.
Yeah.
We
have strict rules.
There are certain things you shouldn't have to tell people, right? That falls under that column. But I mean, I saw a joke recently where they said, like, in the 70s, when you bought a new car, inside the car manual, it showed you how to do the timing belt and how to adjust the timing belts and stuff like that. And now the new car manuals tell you don't drink the fluid out of the car battery. But they have to put it in there because we're in such a litigious society that somewhere along the line somebody drank battery fluid, and now the car manufacturers have to put that in their manuals.
Oh, yeah. Are you like a manual reader? Like, I am the kind of person who reads the car manual, and I was heartbroken when my car was broken into a few months ago, and they stole everything out of my car.
And the manual.
And the manual.
Why would they need the manual?
Why do you need the frickin' manual? Why do you
Maybe
need this?
Maybe just some reading material. You know?
I got a new car like a month ago, and I spent 2 days reading the manual.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And I know we sound really old school. Everyone's like, just look it up, right? And I get that. Believe me, I do get that. And that is faster than trying to find the section in the manual. But I am the kind of person who keeps the manual to every machine that I have. So when something happens, I go to the manual. I know I can Google it. I get that.
I was going to say, you know that you can just Google it, right?
I can Google it. And yes, and YouTube will even give me visual instructions. I get that, people.
Yeah, I have a whole drawer dedicated to manuals. The refrigerator, the microwave, the barbecue, everything is in there.
Everything. I know what model it is, everything. So when
it's registered on the website.
Will and everyone else under the age of 40 is losing their minds. They're like, what is it with this too?
I love it. You both definitely know like way more about your devices than me. I get something, that baby's going in the trash or the recycling bin immediately. And if I cannot figure it out, I'm just going to go to YouTube first. I'm not even going to try to read anything.
It's so funny. But I'm so upset that they stole my car manual and they stole
It's absurd.
It is absurd. Like, what are you going to do with that? You're going to sell it? Who's going to buy a manual for a car? Like,
I don't know. They stole everything.
They're going to have to look for one of you two, like another one of you two out there that's like, I need this manual. I got to have this physical manual.
They're going to sell it on eBay. I'm going to buy my manual back on eBay. Oh, crazy. Well,
that'll do it
kids today.
That'll do it for this week's comment section. Thank you so much for everyone who sent those in. You can do that over on our YouTube community page. You can also reach out to us anytime across all social media. We are at My True Crime News. So until next week, see you later.
Bye, Will. Oh, Bobby, this has been such a pleasure. I hope you come back again.
Oh, anytime.
Oh, really? It's just been such a pleasure. So where can people follow you, find you? I know you're always doing commentary. You're always on television. But where can people find you on social media, for example?
Bobby Chacon FBI. That's my Insta. That's pretty much my handle on all my social media. It's just Bobby Chacon, CHACON FBI. And then BobbyChacon.com is my website. I try to keep up with that. I'm not very successful, but I have a YouTube channel as well. They can find me on YouTube, but they have to use the FBI because there's a very famous boxer named Bobby Chacon. He was like a 5-time different world champion in different weight classes. And so if you just put Bobby Chacon there, the first 5 pages on YouTube are going to be this boxer guy. So if you put my name with FBI, you'll find all of my appearances and all of my oxygen and ID and all that stuff that I'm on. And, I probably do about 2 or 3 podcasts a week. And then probably 3 or 4 news hits a week. Now I'm trying to slow that down now. We're getting into the season. I'm a scriptwriter. I'm a screenwriter for televisions and movies. So I'm working on a pilot right now with my boss. And so we're going to be pitching it in the fall. Yeah, I wrote on Criminal Minds for 4 years.
Wow. How fascinating. See?
Yeah.
Like, you can make fun of us for liking our manuals for our cars, yet there you are with your Insta. I'm just saying, okay?
Right. I do that for my mom mostly, so she can see me. She has her little iPad, and she can see my appearances and stuff, and she can see my stuff on Insta. So it's mostly a family thing. And probably if you looked at it now, it's about 20% of me and about 80% of my dogs. And they have their own Insta page, but I forget to kind of go and update their page. So I put all their stuff on my page anyway. My dogs are my life. My wife is a producer, so she's on the road most of the time. In fact, she's been on the road for 2 months now. She gets back from Paris tomorrow because she's an executive producer of the Olympics.
Oh my goodness.
She'll be home tomorrow. Yeah, her 13th games. She's been the showrunner, the EP on 8 of them. Yeah, so she's probably one of 3 people in the world with her Olympic experience. So she'll be home tomorrow. It's been a long time. We're making, she won't see this before she gets home. We're making a little sign. So me and the dogs will be waiting at the Palm Springs airport with a sign, an Olympic sign, welcoming her home. So yeah, we're working on that today. Yeah, but I'm a screenwriter mostly. Yeah, I'm writing a few films and a few television pilots right now. My boss created a show called Desperate Housewives. So him and I worked together. And I wrote a pilot with him for Reba McEntire. We made it in 2019 and we filmed it in Atlanta, and Reba was great in it. And it almost sold. ABC bought it, but then they reneged. So him and I are writing a new pilot, and he wants to make the new version of Desperate Housewives. A little different, but he's writing the woman portion of it. I'm writing the investigative portion of it.
Oh, I love it. It sounds great. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. That's kind of my day job.
The fact that you made time for us, we're just so honored and pleased. And I hope that you do come back. It's been wonderful to have you on.
Sure.
Really
Right.
wonderful.
And congratulations on the new setup and everything. I'm really proud of that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, we have a new show coming out called True Crime News. It debuts September 9th. And so if you've noticed, I've been all over the place, or the last 2 weeks I've been on the road working on the show and doing the podcast remotely, but I'm here now and hitting the road again. And anyway, busy, but all really good.
You're based in New York?
No, I'm based in Los Angeles.
Oh, you are in Los Angeles? Okay, yeah. Okay,
Yeah. I do spend a lot of time in New York when I can, because my son is there. So always trying to come up with some excuse.
Yeah,
it's like,
to go back.
Hey, I just happened to be here.
Mom
right?
shows up. Yeah.
No, I'm not here to bother you. I just happened to be here.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So we hope that you come back. That would be wonderful. So you can find me at Anna G News, Anna with one N, and you can find this episode, all our episodes, wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can go to our website, truecrimenews.com, subscribe to our newsletter. So until next week, this is True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Anna Garcia, and as we always say, don't do crime.